It's time for another episode of Gospel Preaching Live, brought to you by the Kearney Church of Christ, which meets at 406 North Clark in Kearney, Missouri. Make plans to come out and visit the brethren, who look forward to seeing you. And now the host of Gospel Preaching Live, Richard Dodson.
Okay, welcome to Gospel Preaching Live. My name is Richard Dodson. This is another episode. We hope you enjoy it. It's to be a lesson from God's holy word, and it is designed to sow the seed and help those who are seeking God so that their souls may be edified. If you have any questions about this episode or any other episodes that you may see, you can leave any and all spiritual questions. You can text them to 816-686-9517 or email at the email address that's scrolling on the bottom of your screen. If you need any information about the Kearney Church of Christ, you can go to www.kearneychurch.com and you can receive all the information that you would like to have. Now, Gospel Preaching Live airs every Sunday evening at 6 o'clock on Facebook and on YouTube. It also airs every Thursday evenings at 7 o'clock on the same channels. They are also rebroadcast on KPGZ 102.7 FM in Kearney, Missouri. So if you are in the Kearney, Missouri area and you're waking up on a Sunday morning, you want to hear a gospel lesson, you can tune in to 102.7 FM, your hometown radio station, and hear a gospel lesson. And then you'll have time to come and visit the church at 406 North Clark, the Kearney Church of Christ, and visit with them. They start at 9:30 for Bible study and 10:30 for worship. They would love to have you. They're very good people. Gospel Preaching Live is a work of the Kearney Church of Christ. And again, if you have any comments, please share those comments with me. And if you like this, pass it on to somebody else. If you think somebody needs it, pass it on to them. I'm sure they'd like to have it. Tonight, I want to talk to you about humility. Being clothed with humility, to be more specific. When we think about being clothed, we think about the things that we put on, whether it's a jacket, a hat, gloves, a shirt, socks, whatever it may be, some type of material we put on and we clothe ourselves. But the Bible talks about us being clothed with something else. For our text of our lesson, I'd like for you to turn to 1 Peter chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 5 and 6. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 5 and 6. Notice what is said. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud and gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. Now, I want you to think about that. The Lord, through Peter, is instructing us to be clothed with humility. Now, why does he want us to be clothed with humility? Well, when you think about your clothing, clothing is something that people see. They notice what you're wearing. And so with humility, that is something that people would notice in you. They would see Christ being reflected in your life. God does not like the proud. He resisteth them, as he goes on to say. But with a promise, he gives grace to the humble. And so that's another reason why we want to be clothed with humility. We want to get that grace that the Lord promises. Therefore, we try to humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God by doing exactly what he wants us to do, by being clothed with humility. There is a passage that's not in our lesson, but I want you to take notice of this. It's Matthew chapter 18 and verse 4, when Jesus called a little child to him, and that child came. And Jesus said, whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Now, how did the child humble themselves before Jesus? When Jesus called, the child obeyed. And so we need to obey as well. And if we do these things, then we know that the Lord is well pleased, and we are clothing ourselves with humility. That's something that we need to do. And that's why this lesson has been designed, so that we might know what the scriptures teach in regards to clothing ourselves with humility. Now, we have an example of one in which the Lord gave grace to, and that is Samson. We read about him in Judges, actually going back to Judges chapter 13, but when we go back 13 and 14, looking at his birth and on through 16, where it talks about his death. But Samson was a judge, and he was really a remarkable character. If you don't know about the life of Samson, I'd invite you to go back and look. He was a very strong man. When he was born, the Lord had instructed his mother that a razor should not go to his head because he was going to be a Nazarite. And with that, he would have this incredible strength that the Lord blessed him with, and he would use that in war with the Philistines. And he did that very thing. He took the jawbone of a donkey and slew 1,000 men, if you can believe that. That's quite amazing. But he also had a fight with a lion, as you see in the picture here, and he destroyed that lion. But later in life, he got caught. You probably have heard of Delilah. He confided in Delilah and told her what the secret of his strength was. And of course, while he slept, she had his hair cut. And then, of course, the Philistines came and captured him, put his eyes out, took him back to their city, and made him work at the mill where he had to turn the stone that grinded the flour. Now, what took place after that? They called him into a big party they were having for their God, and they were going to make sport of him. But yet here we see where Samson humbled himself before God, and God extends this grace. Notice what we read in Judges chapter 16 and verse 28. It says, "Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me only this once. O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And the Lord granted that request. And Samson knocked over a couple of pillars, and the whole building came down, killing all the people. And it said that there were so many people killed that Samson had not killed as many people in his life compared to the Philistines that were killed that day. So we can see then that Samson humbled himself before God, and God extended that grace. Well, what about others? Is there an opposite example? And yes, there is. Matthew chapter 23, we read of the rulers of the Jews, the scribes and the Pharisees, and Jesus was not happy with them at all. In fact, he had this to say about them in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 4 through 7. He said, "They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and they lay on the people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts and best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplace and being called rabbi by others." Yes, they liked to wear the nice clothing. They liked having the artifacts that made them look so pious, and they liked to have the honor that comes with being of such. That's what they lived for. That's what they liked. And what did Jesus go on to describe them as later in the chapter? Hypocrites. Over and over, he called them hypocrites. Why? Because they did not humble themselves before God. In fact, they went and killed Jesus. If they had humbled themselves before the Lord, they never would have killed Jesus. They would have accepted him and bowed down to him. But they didn't do that. So we can see an opposite example of what Samson did. Samson humbled himself before the Lord, and the Lord extended grace. But with these men, there was no grace extended. They did not humble themselves before God. In John chapter 12 and verse 42 through 43, we read this: "Nevertheless, many, even the authorities," speaking of the Jews, "believed in him. But for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, nor would they be put out of the synagogue, for they love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God." That's what keeps many people from serving God today, is humility. They cannot display humility. Why? Because they don't like it. They want the glory of men. They love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. And we can't allow ourselves to be caught up like that. We have to be willing to humble ourselves before God and not be like these people. In Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 5 through 8, we have a picture, a very vivid picture of 2 scenes. And each one of these scenes depicts a different type of life. Let's discuss the first one. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 5 through 8. "Thus says the Lord, cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart turns away from the Lord. He is like a shrub in the desert and shall not see any good come. He shall dwell in the parched places of the wilderness and an uninhabited salt land." Let's stop right there. They're talking about a man who does not humble himself before God. He trusts in himself. And what is he like? He's like a shrub in the desert. He's not going to see any rain. He's going to be living in the parched places. Why? Because God is not going to extend grace to him, as we saw in the text of our lesson. And he needs that grace. All men need that grace. But yet, because of his pride, he's not going to do it. He's going to trust in himself instead of trusting in God. Now let's look at a different type of man. In this picture, it describes it as something different. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. He is like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream and does not fear when heat comes, for its leaves remain green, and is not anxious in the year of drought, for it does not cease to bear fruit. This is a humble man, someone who bows to the Lord and puts his trust in God. And when that happens, he doesn't have to worry about the calamities of life. Why? Because he knows the Lord's going to be there to take care of him. And that's the different type of men there are in this world. There are those who humble themselves before God, and there are those who don't. And what we have to decide is, are we going to be one of those who humbles ourselves before God? And I would hope we would all want to humble ourselves. Now, if we're going to clothe ourselves with humility, there are 4 points we need to look at. If we apply these 4 points in our lives, I think we will be able to say we have clothed ourselves with humility. These 4 points are these. The first one we're going to discuss is called serving God. The second is serving others. The third is being thankful in prayer. And the fourth is seeking God's will. Again, I think if we examine these 4 points, we will know what we need to do to clothe ourselves with humility. Let's talk very briefly about each point. The first one, I want to look at 3 verses here about serving God. The first one is in 1 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 24. The second verse is 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58. The third one is Colossians 3 and verse 23 through 24. And I would like to invite the listener to take their Bible and study more in depth on each point, because there is much more that can be said. Let's first look at 1 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 24. Now notice what's taking place in this passage. The Israelites wanted a king. Why? Because of pride. They wanted to be like the nations around them. God was their king, but that wasn't good enough. They wanted to keep up with the Joneses. And so Samuel was told to appoint a king, and the Lord was rejected. But notice what the instructions were here. And this is what the Lord speaking through Samuel. He says, fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, and consider how great things he has done for you. Fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart. We're going to see that that applies to us today as well. If we're going to serve the Lord, we have to serve him in truth. Now, how do we do that? Well, same way in John 4 and verse 24, we have to worship in spirit and in truth. And that means according to his word. So we need to serve Jesus as he has instructed, which we read in the revealed will in the New Testament. Now, I want you to notice we have to do this with all our heart. We cannot be someone who is trying to choose between one or the other. We can't be lukewarm. We have to have a desire to put the Lord first in our life. He has to come first. And so that means when we look to serve, the Lord comes first. Now let's look at another passage here in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58. Now the Corinthians had many problems that Paul addressed in his letter. But here in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 58, he makes a point to them that should give them hope on what they could accomplish. He said, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. We should always be abounding in the work of the Lord. In other words, the Lord's concerns are first in our life, and we look to please the one who is greater, and that's God. But our labor is not in vain. What does that mean? That means the Lord's watching. He knows. He knows who is his servants. And if he knows who is his servants, we know there's going to be a reward that follows. So we need to be abounding in this work. How do we abound in something? Well, we're busy doing it. We get busy serving God. And as we're busy serving God, we find out we get better at the very things, the very tasks the Lord has given us to do. Whether it's preaching, singing, helping, watching over the sick, whatever it may be, you're going to get better at it the more you abound in the work of the Lord. And so we need to be busy doing that so we can be the very best that we can be for the Lord. This is something that people do who are putting on humility. We need to clothe ourselves with humility, so we need to serve God. In Colossians chapter 3 And verse 23 through 24, he says, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. We're serving Jesus when we're doing these things, and there is a reward at the end. And so that's why the Lord has to come first. His business is our business. His desires are our desires. Whatever he wishes, we have to look to try to fulfill. As the little child did when Jesus said, come unto me. What did they do? They came to Jesus. When Jesus tells us to do something in his truth, we have to obey. That's part of clothing yourselves with humility. And so, as I see in our first point, we have to serve God, but that's not the only thing that we have to do. We have to serve others as well. You know, there is a passage in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 37, when Jesus tells us that we should love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our mind. And that's supposed to be the greatest commandment. But just a few verses later, he goes, the second is likened to it. He said, you shall love your neighbors yourself. So if we're going to love our neighbor as ourselves, we have to understand we have to be serving others. We're going to look at three passages that correspond with that. Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 10, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 9 through 10, and then finish with Galatians chapter 5 and verse 13 and 14. First, let's look at Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 10. For God is not unjust so as to overlook your work and the love that you have shown for his name in serving the saints, as you still do. Yes, we need to be serving the saints. How do we do that? Oh, many ways. Many ways. We watch it and we look in on them. We go to church to assemble with them. Why? Well, so that we can encourage them to love and good works by not forsaking the assembly. See, well, there's many things that we can do in serving the saints. We can study with them. We can sing with them. We can pray with them. We can weep with them when they're going through hard times. We can rejoice with them when they're having good times. But we can always be encouraging them to serve God. So we need to serve the saints. We need to look in on each other, knowing that they are better than ourselves in our eyes. In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 9 through 10, we read, show hospitality to one another without grumbling. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. How can we use the gifts that the Lord gives us to serve one another? Well, very easy. If you're a rich man, help the poor man. If you are one that has a gift, such as the ability to sing, lead singing, then help the one who doesn't have the same abilities to become better at it. If you are one who is a teacher, help the one who doesn't know. There are various ways that we can go about helping each other and using our gifts to serve each other. But that's what we need to be looking to do. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 13 through 14, it says, for you are called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, for through love serve one another. For the whole law shall be fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That is a very difficult thing to do. You have to be willing to put yourself behind your neighbor. So if your neighbor has a need, that need becomes your need. Your needs become secondary to what your neighbor's is. There's no room for selfishness with humility. Selfishness has to be put aside. And that's something that has to be practiced if you want to clothe yourselves with humility as the Lord has instructed. But now let's talk about our next point. How about being thankful in prayer? Have you ever had someone not thank you for a favor that you did for them? Have you ever extended any type of grace to someone and they just chose to take it for granted? It hurts. Well, the Lord has extended many things for us. As we sing the song, Count Your Many Blessings. If we ever took the time to count our many blessings, we'd understand how good the Lord has been to us. And we need to go to the Lord in prayer and thank him. That is a sign of humility because we don't deserve such grace. I want you to read Colossians chapter 4 and verse 2 with me, and then we'll look at Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6. But first, let's look at Colossians chapter 4 and verse 2. Continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. Yes, the Lord wants us to pray without ceasing. We are to continue steadfastly in it. But notice what he says, to be watchful in it with thanksgiving. We need to be thankful for the very things that the Lord has given us and thank him for it. But that's not enough. We need to be thankful for the things he's given our brothers and thankful and go to the Lord in prayer and thank him for that. All these things we need to be praying and speaking to the Lord and saying thank you, to let the Lord know that we are very thankful for this. That again is a way to help us adorn ourselves in humility. Look in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6 says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Yes, you have the ability to go to the Lord in prayer and let your requests be made known. But don't forget to thank him, because you're not worthy. I'm not worthy. No man is worthy of the grace that's been bestowed upon us. And if you ever have any doubts, read about Jesus and the life that he gave up for you. Think about what he went through in the garden, how he did not want to face this certain death. He prayed and sweated as great drops of blood, asking the Lord that let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but thine be done. Yes, Jesus gave his life for you, and we are most unworthy. And when you consider that, and then you think about all the other blessings the Lord has bestowed upon us, that should make us in awe of the grace that's been bestowed. And we should bow a knee and thank the Lord. That's only fitting and it's only right. The Lord wants to hear from us. He wants to speak to us. Have you spoken to the Lord today? If not, why not? Let's think about our last point. If we're going to clothe ourselves with humility, we need to seek God's will. That's very important. Let's look at Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, and then we'll finish with Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 15 through 17. Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 15 through 17. In Romans 12, Paul said, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by the testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. What does the Lord want us to do? He wants us to be able to discern what is that will of God. How are we going to do that unless we read our Bibles? That is where the will of God is revealed. And so we need to be willing to humble ourselves before God and to pick up our Bibles and start to read it and try to understand it. We need to be willing to get up off our couches and into our cars and drive to church so that we can attend the worship services and hear a sermon and also attend Bible classes so that we can learn more. We need to be seekers of God's will, and God's watching. This is something that the Lord wants us to do, so that we have to humble ourselves before him. Remember, we have to be willing to serve the Lord in truth. If we don't know truth, we can't accomplish that. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 15 through 17, it says, look carefully then, Paul said, then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. I like it when people say we can't understand the Bible. Well, if that's the case, why did Paul command us to understand what the will of the Lord is? The Lord is not a Lord of confusion. He gave us his message, and he expects us to study and understand his will. And as the little child who came to Jesus, who obeyed his command, we need to be willing to obey the command of the Lord and to be seeking to understand his will. Again, that's not going to happen miraculously. We're going to have to be willing to study. Okay, the lesson's yours. I hope it's been beneficial to you. We looked at 4 points that's going to help us clothe ourselves with humility. We talked about serving God. We talked about serving others. We talked about being thankful in prayer and seeking God's will. Again, if you expand on this study, I think you'd be better served. I hope you'll have the time to do that. Let's close with Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12 through 14. Paul said, put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you. So you also must forgive. And above all these things, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Now, what does Paul say here? He says, put on. Just like you'd put on a hat, put on gloves, put on a shirt, whatever clothing you're going to wear, he's telling you to put it on. And what's he telling you to put on? One of the things he's telling you to put on is humility, because the Lord wants that humility to be seen by others. And the only way that's going to happen is if you adorn yourself properly in a spiritual sense. Okay, the lesson's yours. I hope it's been beneficial to you. When you have opportunity and you're in the Kearney area, please come and visit us at 406 North Clark. Again, we have Bible study at 9:30 on Sunday morning, 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening, and 10:30 a.m. on Sunday morning is our worship service. We'd love to meet you and talk with you and visit with you. Again, you can go to www.kearneychurch.com to find answers to all things pertaining to the church. If you like this show, and you might enjoy others as well, Sowers with Swords is an episode that comes on, an internet show that comes on with me and my brother-in-law, Chris Peltz, who is the minister of the Southside Church of Christ in Springfield, Missouri. We discuss issues, and we compare that with the Bible and what the Bible teaches. It comes on every Tuesday at 10 o'clock. You can catch that show. Again, you can go to kearneychurch.com and click on the Facebook page, and you can catch Sowers with Swords Tuesday mornings at 10 o'clock. Berean Spirits is another such show, but it's with 4 other preachers, myself included. And so with that said, you can tune in and you'll see men studying the Bible and studying with those who tune in an effort to display the same spirit that the Bereans showed in Acts chapter 17. But again, if you're in the Kearney area on a Sunday morning and you want to hear God's word, 102.7 FM on Sunday mornings, KPGZ, you can tune in there to hear another episode of Gospel Preaching Live. If you are not in the Kearney area and you still want to listen, you can stream the signal through the internet. Okay, that's all I have for you this evening. The next episode of Gospel Preaching Live will be this Thursday at 7 p.m. I hope you will tune in and we'll get to study again from God's most holy word. Remember, this is the day the Lord has made. Let's rejoice in it and be glad.
This has been Gospel Preaching Live. Join us each week as truth is taught, faith is examined, and beliefs are challenged. Be sure and hit the like button so you can be notified of future episodes. And to watch past episodes, go to our website, kearneychurch.com. This has been a work of the Kearney Church of Christ.